The Dirt with me, Mike Howell, an economics podcast where I present the down and dirty agronomic science to help grow crops and bottom lines. Inspired by eKonomics.com, farming's go-to informational resource, I'm here to break down the latest crop nutrition research, news, and issues, helping farmers make better business decisions through actionable insights. Let's dig in. Well, hello again, everyone. Welcome back to The Dirt. Things are getting rolling around here in the South. We've got some guys that are putting corn seed in the ground, and it won't be long before we're thinking about planting a little bit of cotton. Today, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about a crop we haven't spent much time talking about. You know, we talk about it in our Thanksgiving episodes and how we have to have sweet potatoes on the table for Thanksgiving. Now, that's one of my favorite dishes, and today, I thought we'd spend a little time talking about sweet potatoes. To help us do that, we've got Philip McKibben with us. I met Philip back when I was a student at Mississippi State. He was a consultant there in the area, and we did quite a bit of work together. And then a few years ago, we kind of got back together when the peanuts started taking off in the state of Mississippi. And we rejoined a few years ago. Philip had some problems with some sweet potatoes, and we've been working on that for a couple of years now. But Philip, welcome to The Dirt.
Glad to be here.
Philip, if you will, take just a few minutes and introduce yourself to our listeners. Let them know where you are and what you do.
I am Philip McKibben, and I'm an independent crop consultant located in north central part of Mississippi. We work in the Hill region of the state as well as part of the Mississippi Delta. And we provide consulting services on all the row crops that are produced in our area, cotton, corn, soybeans being the main ones, but we specialize in all aspects of sweet potato production. And I happen to work in the part of the state where 90% of the sweet potatoes are produced. For those not familiar with Mississippi, the industry really began and is centered in Vardaman, Mississippi, which is locally at least referred to as the sweet potato capital of the world.
It is, and there's a store there on the side of Highway 8 going through the middle of Vardaman, Sweet Potato Sweets. If you're ever in the area, I highly encourage you to stop by, and they make a little bit of everything you can possibly make out of a sweet potato. So, Philip, I don't know if you even knew this, but my family is from the Vardaman area. My dad says he's from Dermer, but nobody in the world except me and you know where Dermer, Mississippi is. I wake up a lot of mornings, and I'm kind of jealous of you and your position there. You get up in the morning and go scout these fields, and a lot of times you don't see or hear from anybody for the entire day. The part of the world you work in, cell phone service just doesn't exist a lot of times, and I can't help but think that would be awful nice to not have to answer a cell phone or check a text message all day for a day or two. That seems pretty sweet to me.
Well, that's a two-edged sword. You also don't have the ability to go online and look up labels and do other research while you're in some of those areas.
Well, Philip, let's kick this off and start talking a little bit about sweet potatoes. And I guess a good way to start is let's define what a sweet potato is and kind of a biological definition of what a sweet potato is.
Well, a sweet potato is actually an underground storage root with a vascular cambium layer, just like other roots. So it has a skin and a bark on the outside of that yellowish orange flesh that we're all familiar with. So it's not an actual tuber, although it is commonly referred to as a tuber. And occasionally we also hear sweet potatoes referred to as yams. Everybody knows what candied yams are. However, the true yam is an underground stem of a grass plant, actually related to some of the lilies that we grow in the U.S., and they're primarily grown in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Central and South America as a food product. It's a really starchy vegetable and doesn't have that sweet flavor profile of a sweet potato. But the sweet potato is actually a morning glory species. It's in the same genus Ipomoea as all of our morning glory weed species. And so it is a storage root, and therefore it, management-wise, is a little different than any other crop that we produce.
We grow it a lot different than most of the other crops we produce. You know, while a lot of our listeners are accustomed to corn and soybean production, cotton production, a lot of our traditional row crops, but I'd venture to say a lot of our listeners have never even seen a sweet potato field. So, Philip, if you would, talk a little bit about sweet potato production, the process, and what has to happen to get a sweet potato field going.
Well, as we've said, this crop is not like other row crops in that we don't plant seeds. We actually transplant a plant cutting, which some people refer to as slips, and those plants are transplanted into the soil with mechanical transplanters. We grow our sweet potatoes on raised beds, generally 38-inch to 40-inch row spacings. Most of the equipment's either 8-row or 12-row on 38s. And good drainage is essential. We need a good tall row. And we'll talk a little bit more about drainage later. But the big thing is you can't go to the store and buy transplants. A producer who grows sweet potatoes, it's their responsibility to grow their own plants, to cut and take to the field and transplant those. And if you think about a replant situation, you can't just go out and buy more seed and replant. It can make for a really sticky situation if you get halfway through planting and end up having to back up and replant 100 acres. So this entire crop is vegetatively propagated. Each plant growing in the field is a clone of another plant, which was a clone of another plant. And it's a fairly complex process, sort of like the chicken and the egg. It has to start somewhere. And in the past, we generally started with seed potatoes. We just bought seed potatoes from somebody that had high quality seed potatoes. But in modern sweet potato production, the crop literally starts in a petri dish in a laboratory with a meristematic stem separation where they take a little clump of cells, 2 to 3 cell layers deep, from the growing point to avoid any viruses that might be in that existing plant. That plant that's in that petri dish then is grown into what we refer to as a mother plant. That mother plant is basically in a hanging basket inside a cage, inside of a greenhouse, and cuttings are made off of that plant. They're planted into the greenhouse. Cuttings are made off of those plants, and then those plants are sold to growers who then plant them in their greenhouse, and then we keep expanding until the greenhouse is full, take them to the field, we plant those in the field, and we take vine cuttings off of those plants and set more acres so we can build up the numbers of seed roots or seed potatoes. And basically we like to wipe the slate clean. Every generation that goes by, the genetics are contaminated by viruses, mutations, potentially disease or nematode even. So we like to start with this generation 0, which is this mother plant that came originally from a petri dish. And when we end up with these plants that are cuttings off of cuttings off of cuttings of this plant, when we dig those seed potatoes, those roots, when we dig those in the fall, we call those generation 1 or G1 seed potatoes. And these are the potatoes that we save for the next year to bed so that we can produce the plants. So that is our foundation seed program. We dig those acres, and those roots are called G2s or generation 2, and that's where the bulk of our seed potatoes come from, because we've got the volume that we need to plant the rest of our crop.
Philip, that's a whole lot different than how my dad used to have me doing it in the garden. We would take a couple of potatoes and stick them in a fruit jar and get them rooted that way and get the vines going, and we would take the cuttings off of that, and that would be our sweet potatoes. But I know that the sweet potatoes that we grew at home never were nearly as good as the sweet potatoes that y'all are raising up there in the Vardaman area. I always said that had a lot to do with the soil. Talk a little bit about the specifics of the soil and why that soil is so different up there in that area and why the potatoes grow so well in that certain soil.
Well, people specifically in the Vardaman area definitely take pride in the quality of the product that's produced there, and they've been doing it for generations. And the truth is, sweet potatoes can grow in not a wide variety of soil, but it doesn't have to be a specific soil type. 90% of the soils in our part of the state are all classified as silt loam soils, but there is a wide range of what's classified as silt loam, anything from a sandier side of that spectrum to the heavier side bordering on a clay loam. But it seems that the silt component is what allows us to produce the iconic shape that consumers prefer. And being a fresh market product, shape of the potato and the outward appearance is as important as the flavor and the sweetness of the orange flesh that everybody's familiar with. And in some cases, maybe even more important, the end customer, the consumer in the grocery store, they seem to be pretty picky about which potatoes they want to pick up and put in their basket. That silt loam is kind of the sweet spot of the soil texture. We can grow in some heavier soils, but drainage is absolutely critical. So if we're on the heavier side, we need to make sure that we have bare minimum of 0.2% row slope, and we have to have that tall bed. And on sandier soils, we can tolerate a little less row slope if we have good infiltration rates, good internal drainage in that soil. Sweet potatoes do not like wet feet. In Mississippi, one August thunderstorm can dump 2 inches of rainfall on a field in 30 minutes, and that rain is either going to run off or completely saturate the field for the next 3 days. And one of those scenarios is typical. The other can ruin the crop.
Well, Philip, I know we grow a lot of sweet potatoes there in the Vardaman area in Mississippi. I know they've experimented with them in the Delta a few times, but we always hear a lot about North Carolina sweet potatoes. I know they're a big sweet potato producing area. The northern Delta there in Louisiana produces a lot of sweet potatoes. Are there any other major producing sweet potato regions around the country?
You pretty well mentioned the main ones, except for California. California is I think North Carolina by far is in the number one position. And then California and Mississippi and then Louisiana.
Philip, you talked about the seed potatoes and how we get the crop started. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other things you have to work around there in the sweet potato field. The first thing that comes to mind is insects. What kind of insect pests do we have there?
Well, being a below ground crop, our real concern are the soil insects that actually feed on the sweet potato roots. So wireworms, white grubs, those are the most serious pests that we deal with. And for the most part, the only effective treatments that we have are these pre-planted soil incorporated insecticides. But anything that can feed on leaves of any crop can attack sweet potatoes. We have cucumber beetles and flea beetles, which also have besides being a foliage feeder, they also have a below ground stage in their development. The grubs are below the soil line, but cabbage loopers, soybean loopers, they can strip the leaves off. In the entire armyworm complex, about 5 different species that we commonly see, they feed primarily on the leaves, but in some cases, they, particularly fall armyworm and southern armyworm, those two caterpillar pests plus granulate cutworm are exceptionally damaging because they can feed on the leaves and then they burrow into the ground and they can eat in the tops of the potatoes. And occasionally we have sugarcane beetles that can come in late in the season and burrow straight down into the ground and feed on the storage roots. And we also deal with nematodes. Reniform is common through most of our fields, but the root knot nematode is by far the most destructive nematode pest.
Philip, you talked about a lot of insects there, and I've got a background in entomology. When I was working on my master's degree in entomology, we took an insect taxonomy class, and Angus Catchot, I know a lot of our listeners will recognize that name. We were in the same class, and Angus always wanted to do above and beyond. He came in with an insect, and Dr. Baker threw a fit. That insect wasn't supposed to be found in Mississippi. Where did he find that? This insect was quarantined, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about already. Talk about the sweet potato weevil and how that's quarantined in Mississippi, and we're not supposed to be bringing other sweet potatoes into the area and that kind of stuff.
Sweet potato weevil is one quarantine. There are a couple of others as well. Sweet potato weevil occurs in the coastal region, South Alabama, South Mississippi, and into Texas. So they can't survive the winters in this part of the state and in the main growing regions of Mississippi, Alabama, and on up the eastern seaboard. There's a kind of an artificial line, which is Interstate 20, and basically we consider that sweet potato weevil can exist south of Interstate 20, but basically north of Interstate 20 we don't have the sweet potato weevil. But there is a quarantine and there's a testing program, so they call it a voluntary trapping program, where traps are put out around every field in the state of Mississippi. It's a voluntary program, but if you don't participate, you don't get the green tag to go in your sweet potatoes, which allow them to be shipped outside the state of Mississippi. So there's a 100% participation rate in that voluntary program.
I bet it is. So, Philip, talk a little bit about weed control. You already mentioned that sweet potatoes are basically a morning glory species. I imagine it can get kind of dicey with weed control, with everybody trying to kill morning glories and other crops and a sweet potato field right beside it.
It can. Sweet potatoes, morning glories are not a serious weed issue, but the biggest challenge that we have is just a lack of labeled products. Being a specialty crop, the companies just haven't done the research and don't have the data to give to the EPA to support the label use, and there's just not enough acres to generate the revenue that they would need in order to pursue those labels. So we rely heavily on pre-emergent herbicides and plowing, and for the most part, that's what we can do. We do have our grass or herbicides, graminicides that we can apply post-transplant. Everything else is pre-transplant. So there's a lot of hand weeding. Palmer pigweed is a serious problem on farms where we have it. Ground cherry, copperleaf, or a couple of others that can give us fits.
And I guess the last pest group we want to talk about is the diseases. You talked about some of the seedling diseases that you wanted to make sure you didn't transmit through the seed. What other types of diseases do you have to worry with?
Well, that is the critical thing, is just sanitation. To make sure, since we're growing our transplants in these plant beds, when we cut the plants, we need to make sure we stay 1.5 inches, 2 inches above the soil line, so that we're not taking infested soil to the field and taking a problem that's on 1/10 of an acre and spreading it across 10 acres. That's the biggest thing that we watch for. Scurf is a problem that it's a fungal pathogen that is pretty well unique to sweet potatoes. It's in all soils, but it takes very specific environmental conditions for that to be a problem. But year in, year out, we have issues with southern blight, which is Sclerotium rothschiei, and fusarium rot. And we also have, it's referred to as proximal end rot, but it's a charcoal rot macrophamina organism. And none of the fungicides are really effective below the soil. So once we've got the crop transplanted, it's in the bag already.
Philip, we've talked about insect control, weed control, disease control, but from my time living in that area and going up through there to see family on Thanksgiving as a kid, I know there's another pest of sweet potatoes that we haven't mentioned. Talk about the problem with the deer and how the deer love sweet potatoes, and is there anything you can do to prevent that damage in your sweet potatoes?
Well, deer are a serious pest, as you mentioned, but wild hog is becoming just as serious of a problem. A lot of our sweet potatoes are produced in bottomlands, creek bottoms, some of the river bottoms. We have some pretty high wild hog populations, so there's a lot of trapping, a lot of hunting. Almost every producer that we work for has multiple rifles with the thermal imaging scopes, and they get depredation permits and kill deer at night, which is not that's kind of a hotbed topic. You have people that rent land next to a sweet potato operation for hunting, and then, they see the buzzards circling in July, but it's necessary. In some cases, they can cost literally hundreds and hundreds of dollars per acre. There's one farm that they've built a 5-strand electric fence around a couple of fields just to keep the deer out and have it where they can rotate into that crop. But there's no easy solutions. That's the problem with those pests.
Yep, and I know a lot of people not right there in that area, but they'll actually go get some of the cull potatoes and use those to bring deer in as a food source for them and kind of hunt over those sweet potatoes. Deer love those sweet potatoes, but
Absolutely.
we've got to have a balance there somewhere. We've talked a lot about the production process and things you have to watch out for. Let's move now and talk a little bit about the harvest operations. You know, I've seen sweet potato harvest all my life, and it's quite an operation out there. Tell our listeners how they get the sweet potatoes out of the field and what all goes into that.
There are two main types of harvest operators. We have to get the potatoes out of the ground, obviously, so there's some specialized equipment. But the two types, one type, a lot of labor involved. The one type, the labor actually rides on the digger itself, and they sort and grade the potatoes, and they go into these 20-bushel wooden bins that you see all over the Vardaman area if you happen to drive through on Highway 8. The other type of work crew is they turn the potatoes up, leave them on the surface, and then we run bucket crews. So these guys are actually on the ground with vegetable buckets, and they grade the potatoes and then throw them up on the truck where they're dumped into these 20-bushel bins. And then they're hauled from there to storage facilities. And thinking about those bins, if you are ever on a sweet potato operation, these bins are everywhere, and you kind of take them for granted. But those wooden boxes cost somewhere around $175 a piece. They hold 20 bushels of potatoes, and you don't really think about it unless you have a 400-bushel yield, and then all of a sudden you better have $3,000 to $4,000 an acre invested already in boxes. There again, you can't go out and buy a bunch of boxes. You can order them a year in advance and have them manufactured, but that is one of the barriers to entry in this market, is that type of investment in something as simple as the wooden box that we haul these sweet potatoes out of the field in.
Philip, you mentioned grading the sweet potatoes. Is that done in the field, or is that done when they get back to the warehouse? And talk a little bit about the grades of sweet potatoes.
Potatoes are actually graded twice. They are graded in the field by size, shape, and quality, and they go into these 20-bushel bins. Basically, the U.S. #1 is the grade. That's where the money is, and that's what we try to optimize in our yield. The potatoes that are too large to meet the #1 specification, or they're too small, or they're lower quality, they have some insect damage, or if they get skinned during harvest, then those go to the canner market, which is less money per bushel. So the U.S. #1, that's our target, that's our goal, is produce maximum #1s.
And Philip, after we get them out of the field, talk a little bit about the storage process. How do we have to handle these potatoes? And they can't all be shipped out right there at Thanksgiving time. I know we can get sweet potatoes all year round. So how do they store these potatoes and make them safe for us to eat year round?
This is where the industry has changed a lot in the last 15 years, really. We used to have a fresh market, so when we started harvesting in the fall, we could bring those potatoes in, wash them, grade them, box them up, ship them out, and they were in a grocery store within 2 or 3 days. But the grocery distributors, the buyers, want the same quality of product 12 months out of the year. So it takes several weeks for sweet potatoes to cure, and that is once they come into the storage facility, they have to be maintained at a very specific temperature and humidity so that those starches are converted into the sugars, the maltose and the fructose and some sucrose there that gives the potato the flavor and the texture that consumer wants. So that consistency of product has forced growers to build huge warehouse facilities that are both heated and cooled so that we can keep them at a constant 58 degrees and 85% relative humidity 12 months out of the year. And that's a huge cost, but that's what is necessary to get the contracts and to keep buyers happy.
As far as I can tell, we've talked about just about everything except one critical aspect here, and I wanted to save this one for last because it's kind of what we focus on predominantly here on the dirt. Let's talk a little bit about fertility and what kind of fertility needs these sweet potatoes need. I guess let's start off with general recommendations for N, P, and K.
Generally, we're applying about 50 pounds of nitrogen and that all, for the most part, goes out pre-plant. We're running 50 to 60 pounds of phosphate, P2O5, 150 to 200 pounds of K2O, or potash, and that would be a very typical fertilizer application. Most of it is done pre-plant. Occasionally, some people will split that. The big thing regarding fertility or fertilizer is sweet potato being a storage root. It responds differently than almost any other crop that I've ever worked or even studied. This storage root is not a reproductive mechanism, it's a survival mechanism. So if you think about all the grain crops, we try to avoid stress at all costs. If you stress a corn crop, your yield is going to suffer. Cotton, we know that cotton lint are just elongated cell wall cells of the seed. So the more seed, the healthier seed, the higher the yield. In the case of a storage root, if that plant never undergoes any stress, then why does it need a storage root? Basically, that storage root is for hard times, so stress can actually induce more storage root development. It creates difficult decisions for us sometimes because this crop does not respond to fertilizer like other crops do. So that 50 units of nitrogen in California on their deep sands where they're furrow irrigating, they may furrow irrigate 6 or 8 times during the season, and they're maybe running 200 units of nitrogen. 98% of our sweet potatoes are dry land, and they actually seem to prefer it. We can get into trouble with irrigation, but that 50 units of nitrogen, we can cut it in half or we can double it, and we just don't see much difference. So fertilizer, we just basically go basic, and fertility is what seems to be the key. Just making that distinction between fertility and fertilizer. We try to focus on the rotational crops. If we need to build the fertility on a farm, we don't do it during the sweet potato rotation. We do it when that field is in cotton, when that field's in soybeans, when that field's in corn. And then we rely on that built-up soil native fertility when we come in and plant our sweet potato crop. Because if we haul 3 tons of sweet potatoes out of the field, then we know we're hauling a lot of potash. We know what the removal rates are, but we just don't see a response to more fertilizer.
So, Philip, what about any of the micronutrients? I know a lot of these specialty crops may need some different micronutrients or different amounts of micronutrients. Is there anything that stands out on the micronutrient end that you have to watch out for?
Occasionally on some soils, you can see zinc deficiency. It's a rare case. Most of the soils that we are planting this crop on, they're fairly fertile soils. We've maintained fertility on those rotational crops. So we don't really see a lot of nutrient deficiencies, micronutrient or otherwise. Zinc is the big one. We will see zinc deficiency occasionally. And most of these fertilizer applications that are going out on this crop have a micro pack or some type of a micronutrient combination that's going out with it, more for insurance than because we get into trouble if we don't have it.
Well, Philip, we've talked about a lot of stuff today. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to visit with us. I know I've learned a lot about sweet potato production, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners have enjoyed this as well. Do you have any closing comments or any take-home message you want to leave our listeners with before we wrap this segment up?
In the late 1930s, early 1940s, the consumption of sweet potatoes in the U.S. was about 40 pounds per year. Large U.S. #1 weighs about a pound, so 100 years ago, U.S. consumers were eating about 40 sweet potatoes a year. You mentioned Thanksgiving. Now we've got Mother's Day, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, and most people are eating 3 sweet potatoes a year. But in the last few years, because people are becoming more health conscious, because there is the sweet potato French fry market, there's sweet potato chips, consumption is up, but this vegetable is a highly nutritious and, of course, delicious vegetable. So it's high in beta carotene, high in vitamin A. So it's a high quality food product that we really need to consider more than just twice a year.
Philip, I consider them way more than twice a year. I keep a box of sweet potatoes in my house at all times. So we probably have sweet potatoes at least once a week or so around my house. We love them.
You're a good man.
Oh, well, listeners, we appreciate you tuning in today. I hope you've learned as much about sweet potato production as I have today. And if you will, hang around for just a couple of moments and we'll be right back with segment 2. Farming isn't farming without questions. And now there's a place to go for answers. At eKonomics, an entire team of agronomists is waiting and ready to help for free. No question is too big or too small. Visit Nutrien-economics.com and submit your question with the Ask an Agronomist feature. Well, listeners, welcome back for segment 2. It's time now that we visit with one of our agronomists and ask them a question of the week. We have Dr. Alan Blaylock back with us again this week. Alan, welcome back to the Dirt.
Thanks, Mike. This has been an interesting series. It's been a pleasure to come on and participate, answer some of these questions.
Alan, we've asked you several questions this year already about nitrogen loss. Today's question is another question in that same area. You know, we've talked about denitrification and volatilization, but this week our question is, what is leaching and what can growers do to manage this type of nitrogen loss?
Well, leaching, Mike, is the downward movement of mobile forms of nitrogen, specifically the nitrate form, down beyond the root zone. So once it gets past the root zone of the crop and the crop can't use it, we consider that to be lost. We call that leaching. So nitrate is an anion. It's not held on the cation exchange complex, so it's very mobile in the soil. It goes wherever the water goes. So if the water's moving down and we have nitrate in the soil, we can have leaching loss. So how do we manage that? Well, unless that leaching is caused by irrigation, there's not much we can do about that rainfall. So we have to think about managing the nitrogen. The rainfall is going to come, and we have these episodes where we have a big rainfall event where the water is moving down through the soil. It's going to pick up some of that nitrate. It's not going to take it all, but it's going to take some of that nitrate with it as it moves downward, and then that's lost. Can't control that. So what do we do? Probably the best method of control is to spread that nitrogen supply out, because as with denitrification, these come with rainfall events. Leaching's not probably going on constantly. It's occurring with these big rainfall events. And some research out of Minnesota is showing that most of our leaching loss occurs in something like 4 to 6 rainfall events through the growing season. So we want to reduce the amount of nitrogen that's available in the soil at the time these rainfall events occur. Well, we can't predict the rainfall events, so making split applications in soils that are prone to leaching, spreading that nitrogen out in multiple applications through the season. The other thing we can do is use materials like nitrification inhibitors. As we talked about with denitrification, the nitrification inhibitors slow the conversion of ammonium to nitrate, so we reduce the amount of nitrate that's present in the soil for the period of time that those inhibitors are effective, typically somewhere in the range of 4 to 10 weeks. Also, slow and control release fertilizers are extremely effective because, again, they're metering that nitrogen out over a period of time, reducing the amount of nitrogen that's in the soil exposed at any point in time when those leaching events occur. So the choice of fertilizer materials or additives or supplements that reduce the nitrate concentration in the soil is an excellent management practice, in effect similar to splitting the nitrogen application and applying it multiple times in the season.
Alan, once again, great information. We appreciate you taking time to visit with us and answer our questions for us this week. Listeners, thanks again for tuning in this week. And as always, if you have any questions about anything we're talking about here on the program, you can visit our website at nutrien-economics.com. Until next time, this has been Mike Howell with The Dirt. Hey guys, if you like what you heard today, do us a favor and share this podcast with someone else. It could be your neighbor, your friend, your crop advisor, or whoever you think would enjoy it. Your support helps ensure future episodes, so please like, subscribe, share, and rate the show wherever you're listening from.